Our story begins not in Singapore but in China in the year 1976. Mao Zedong has just died after ruling China for 27 years. The Cultural Revolution has been going on for a decade and things aren't looking good. The economy is struggling, there's social unrest, there's incredible poverty and a lot of violence. The GDP per capita is a mere 165 US dollars, 1/10 the global average. The responsibility of turning things around falls on the new leader, Deng Xiaoping. He knows that something needs to change. If China has to realize her destiny of being a great nation, Deng will have to change course. He begins first of all by officially condemning the Cultural Revolution and does away with many of the radical policies of Chairman Mao. Then Deng shifts his attention towards the real problem, the economy. And he's looking for a new economic model because clearly the agrarian communism of Chairman Mao is not working. So in November 1978, he goes on a tour to Southeast Asia. First to Thailand, then Malaysia, and finally the tiny nation of Singapore. In Singapore, he sees that unlike China, the economy is booming. He sees the sprawling infrastructure, the rising incomes, the confident and optimistic population, the social harmony, all led by a very strong Prime Minister, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. Deng is impressed. Is this the economic model that he was looking for? He definitely believes so because in his mind, he thinks that if Singapore can do it, the country that was founded by Chinese immigrants, which is led by a government that draws inspiration from Chinese philosophy and run by a prime minister who is himself of Chinese heritage, China can do it too. The rest is history. We all know what happened after that. China lifted more than 850 million people out of poverty. Its GDP per capita grew at 10% compounded for the next 30 years. And it became perhaps the greatest economic miracle ever seen in human civilization. So what did Deng Xiaoping see in Singapore? You are listening to All Risk is Creative, and this is Lee Kuan Yew Creates Order. Hello and welcome to the third episode of All Risk is Creative, and I am your host, Palash Kulkarni. Our story today is about Lee Kuan Yew, the founder and the first Prime Minister of Singapore, and someone who is widely regarded as one of the greatest statesmen to have ever lived. As I said, he not only transformed Singapore from a poor, impoverished nation to one of the richest countries in the world, all within one generation, but also showed a path forward of progress and development to other countries in Asia, China being one of them. So let's begin on August 9, 1965, the lowest point of Lee Kuan Yew's life. On this day, Singapore separates from Malaysia. Separation is actually a charitable word. A more accurate phrase is thrown out. Singapore is thrown out by Malaysia. It had never happened in the history of the world before that a larger nation voluntarily threw out a smaller territory. Naturally, Lee Kuan Yew, the leader of Singapore, is heartbroken. He had rallied the entire nation just 2 years back to merge with Malaysia. And now, his dream lies shattered. Lee Kuan Yew addresses a press conference. He's trying to speak, but he cannot because he's holding back his tears. He's whimpering. He says that all his adult life, he fought for the unification of Singapore and Malaysia, and he thought that he had finally succeeded 2 years back in 1963 when the two countries finally merged. And he doesn't say this next part, but he knows that the very reasons why he wanted Singapore to merge with Malaysia, like Singapore has a small land area that has no natural resources, no defense capabilities, a relatively uneducated and unskilled population, absence of a large economic market. The reasons that made the existence of Singapore as a sovereign independent nation impossible, now those reasons are his new reality. He has to build a nation with all those disadvantages, a task he himself thought was impossible just 2 years back. He finally breaks down in the press conference and he asks the reporters to leave him alone for some time. He needs to weep. He's 42 years old, his lifelong dream has been squashed, but he has to move forward. Singapore has to move forward. But the road ahead is very hard. Because Singapore is so small, and that's a disadvantage, by the way, not an advantage as many people popularly believe. Because of its small size, Singapore does not have a hinterland. That means no natural resources. Lee Kuan Yew described Singapore as a heart without a body, meaning all it has is a port. But how does it maximize the capacity of the port when there are no natural resources, no human resources, and therefore no industry to speak of? That's the perfect recipe for becoming a client state of much larger and richer countries. Second, if you're a small country with a small population, how do you defend yourself in a hostile neighborhood that has much bigger armies? The army at the time in Singapore was provided by the UK and they were about to pull out too. And tensions were still high with Malaysia and Indonesia, which were much bigger countries. Third, if your population is poor and unskilled, how do you even begin to create an economic market? Even if you somehow manage to produce, manage to create a supply, how do you create the demand? How does the government generate revenue? But there was another problem, a much bigger existential problem, which was that there was no strong Singaporean identity to speak of. In 1965, Singapore's population was made of 75% people of Chinese heritage, 15% of Malay heritage, and 10% other ethnicities. They all spoke different languages, they all had different belief systems, they all had different cultures. And they did not get along well with each other, especially the Chinese and the Malay. In fact, that's the reason why Singapore is thrown out by Malaysia. And these racial tensions still persisted in 1965 Singapore. So that's another problem that Lee Kuan Yew has to deal with. In fact, that's the number one problem. So he has to build an identity, literally create it, construct it, and only then he can tackle all the other challenges. Now, if you were an informed economic and political thinker, and if you had looked at the Singapore of 1965, newly independent with all these challenges, you would have given Singapore next to zero chances of survival. Let alone even imagine that this country will go on to become the second richest country in the entire world within one generation. Because how can a leader, after getting the psychological blow of his life, remember, never before in history a country had been thrown out and humiliated like this? How can a leader come back from that, after crying in front of his entire nation, feeling helpless and betrayed? A sense of order, harmony, and balance is an old Confucian value. Confucianism, or the teachings of Confucius, the great Chinese philosopher who lived around the 5th century BC, lies at the very heart of countries in the Sinosphere. Sinosphere, broadly, is the group of countries whose history and culture have been influenced by the Chinese civilization. Countries like China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and of course, Singapore. In fact, Confucianism is so fundamental to these countries that sometimes they are collectively called Confucianist cultures or Confucianist countries. And everything within the philosophy is geared towards the goal of achieving social harmony and order. Because order, as per Confucianism, is not only the starting point, but also a catalyst for individual and social progress. So for Lee Kuan Yew, the importance of order was not an acquired value. It was coded deeply inside him right from his birth, since he was of Chinese heritage. And he believed that if he has to build a nation, A strong sense of order is a necessity. In fact, it is agenda number one. It is the absolute foundation on which the entire nation will be built. And it sounds very trite when I say it like it, but there's a difference in how most people perceive this idea of order, which is they mostly take it for granted, and how critical, as I said, agenda number one, it was for Lee Kuan Yew. Now, I'm going to give you a very dumb example to drive home this point, all right? Suppose you wake up on a Monday morning and realize that you have a very busy day ahead. You have dozens of things on your to-do list. There's work, there's some errands you need to run, there's some personal calls you need to make. And on top of that, your house is a complete mess. Everything is scattered. Nothing is at the right place where it should be. And you have to take care of that as well. Now, there are two types of people. The first category is people like me, who will look at the mess and will say, okay, that's just one more item on my to-do list, not a critical item. I'll probably get to it when I finish all the other things off my list. And then there's a second category of people, like my mom, who will say, no, that is agenda number one, because a clean and organized house, a clean and organized surrounding leads to an organized mind. And cleaning up the mess will actually help me do all the other tasks in a better, efficient manner. That's the difference in priorities between most of the world and Confucian values. For Confucianists like Lee Kuan Yew, order is the basis of social progress. It is the foundation on which everything else becomes easier to build. Because without order, you cannot aspire for social progress, for economic growth. And we'll see in this episode how order leads to all of those things. To begin with, you cannot have order and social harmony if there is no unity in people. And in 1965, there's widespread racial unrest in Singapore. There's riots happening between the Chinese and the Malay population. Now, in such a situation, take any average leader from the developing world. What would he have done? Well, he could have easily exploited this fault line to cement his political position. Isn't that what usually happens? He could have easily stoked anger against the minority Malay population, could have divided the country further for his own political gains, because for politicians, fear is so much easier to sell than hope. But if order is your guiding principle, you cannot allow there to be distrust between communities. The most important relationship in Confucianism is the relationship between the ruler and the subject, which in this case is Lee Kuan Yew and the Singaporean citizens. And Confucius advises the ruler to act with Ren, which is Mandarin for benevolence. That is the most important value for the ruler, to act with benevolence. And it is more morally superior than hunger for cementing your own power. So Lee Kuan Yew makes it very clear right away that Singapore is going to be for everyone. The Chinese, the Malay, the Indians, everyone. And this is so unexpected, even for the population of Singapore at the time, that it takes them some time to fully internalize this radical idea. Today, sitting in 2025, we take ideas like secularism for granted, but things were different in 1965. There's an incident that happens in February of 1966 in an army training camp in Singapore. Goh Keng Swee, who was the Minister of Interior and Defense in 1966. And by the way, Goh Keng Swee is a very important person in the history of Singapore. He is considered one of the founding fathers alongside Lee Kuan Yew. Later on, he would serve as the Minister of Finance, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister of Education. In 1966, though, he's the Minister of Defense. So he orders this one army leader in this one training camp to not recruit any more Malays in the army camp. The army leader misinterprets this message, thinking that the minister wants him to not recruit people of Malay heritage. And when he announces this to the camp, obviously all hell breaks loose and a riot breaks out. But what Keng Swee had meant was to not recruit Malaysian citizens and only recruit Singaporean citizens irrespective of their heritage. But the natural expectation of people at the time was that, of course, Lee Kuan Yew and his government will favor his people over those of Malay heritage. The army officer misunderstands this message owing to his own personal bias, and things go wrong. Thankfully, Lee Kuan Yew himself rushes to the army camp, calms people down, reiterates his message of non discrimination, and thankfully, things are under control. Slowly and steadily, a semblance of social harmony takes shape in Singapore. But social harmony, in and of itself, is of no use without economic growth. You could be united as a people, but if people do not prosper, that harmony and order will not hold. And that is where the real challenge is. This is where all the disadvantages of Singapore, the disadvantages that made Lee Kuan Yew believe that Singapore could not exist as an independent nation, come to the forefront. Now, put yourself in his shoes and think about all the limitations you have to work with. Your population is poor, uneducated, and unskilled. That's a good start. It has to change. But how do you do that? Your government doesn't make much revenue. Where will all the money come from? Well, you can always borrow the money, take large amounts of debt, and fund public programs like education, healthcare, some sort of an employment guarantee, maybe. That's the most obvious choice, isn't it? That's what India did, by the way. And if you've not listened to the first episode of this podcast, I highly recommend you do. It's on PV Narasimha Rao, and we talk about much of the failures of the Indian political and economic system from 1947 to 1991 in that episode. India got its independence 18 years before Singapore in 1947. And right after independence, India faced the same problem as Singapore. India too had a poor, uneducated population and no revenue to speak of. So India started borrowing huge amounts of cash to fund these large public schemes. It could have opened foreign investments, which it eventually had to do in 1991, but right after independence, it was ideologically opposed to it because the Indian government didn't like the idea of allowing foreign capitalists to exploit cheap land, cheap labor, and raw materials. In their books, that's what the British had been doing for the last 200 years. Remember, the British Raj began as a rule of a corporate entity, the East India Company. So Lee Kuan Yew did have that choice of doing what India did, which was to fund these large public welfare schemes on borrowed money. In fact, that was the common wisdom at the time, even among the economists, the so-called experts, that third world nations should not open up their economies to first world nations. But Lee Kuan Yew was a first principles thinker. He asked himself, if not allowing foreign investments is indeed the right approach, why is it not working in India? Why is China suffering so much being the closed economy that it is? And why should he be led by dogma and theory and this weird sense of morality when it's clear as daylight that it just doesn't work? And one thing that I understood very clearly about Lee Kuan Yew is that he believes in tough love. He doesn't like coddling his citizens. The citizens should earn their livelihood, and that's how they become tough. That's how they prosper, by creating real economic output, not by being coddled by the government. So Lee Kuan Yew decides that he cannot do what India did. He cannot do what the Western development economists of the time were sanctimoniously preaching. He decides to do the opposite. He decides to focus on attracting foreign investments, especially from American MNCs. And that was a risk because it went against the common wisdom and the so-called expert opinion of the time. And this risk, this single decision to lead with trust, hope, and a positive sound mindset to create economic output by taking help of foreign investments, instead of distrust, pessimism, and this closed zero-sum mindset, this risk, this decision made all the difference. But the next problem was, okay, once you've decided that you want to attract American MNCs to set up their shops in Singapore, why would these American MNCs want to come to Singapore? Okay, sure, cheap land, cheap labor, sure. But there are other countries in the region that can give them that. They are not doing it right now, but eventually they will. And then how will this tiny nation compete against much bigger countries? So what is it that Lee Kuan Yew can do that gives Singapore an edge? not a short-term hedge, because he knows that if his model starts working, everyone around him is going to do the same, and then he's going to be competing with all those bigger countries. So he's not looking for a short-term edge, but something that can be a forever moat, something that he can defend for the rest of his life and beyond. And that becomes his quest. What can he do? What do American companies look for before putting in their money? And so, to answer that question for himself, he takes a sabbatical from his job as the prime minister. He wins the election in 1968 pretty handsomely and goes on a sabbatical. Not to some holiday, not to some vacation, but he goes to study at the Harvard Kennedy School to understand the mind of the American investor. I mean, just imagine, he's the prime minister of a country and he's doing like a summer course in Harvard to seek answers to his questions. That's the kind of guy this is. That's his attitude. It's the right thing to do. I will do it. Let people laugh. And so he spends a lot of time with the capital allocators and the investors and the owners of these big manufacturing companies in America, tries to sell them the Singapore story and also really learn, what can he do back in Singapore to get the Americans to set up their shops there. And it's not like he's going in completely blind. Obviously, he has a hunch. He's not dumb. His focus on creating order isn't coincidental. And that's what he sells to the American investors, that Singapore will have order and political stability like the First World. It is not the First World yet, far from it, but it will be. That's the dream he sells to the American investors. That's his pitch. And it works, at least in the beginning. Texas Instruments, National Semiconductors, and HP become the first few American companies to set up manufacturing facilities in Singapore. But that's largely just beginner's luck based on a few right insights and a great salesman's pitch. It has to sustain, it has to grow, it has to compound. And that is way more difficult. And for that, the order has to sustain. The thing that attracted the investors in the first place. Now, that doesn't happen by taking a sabbatical. It doesn't happen overnight. It is a long, hard process. But how does one begin? How does one create a system that self-perpetuates order? There's a brilliant piece by Fareed Zakaria on Lee Kuan Yew, and it puts into 3 simple words what Lee Kuan Yew's life and approach was all about. It is called culture is destiny, meaning that in a long enough time frame, a country's destiny will converge around the quality of its culture, the values it rewards and the values it reprimands. Because culture is what sustains, culture is what compounds and replicates. Individual decisions may be short term, but creating a certain culture is forever. For me, this is the most powerful idea of the Lee Kuan Yew story. Culture is destiny. That's as true for a person or a company as it is for a country. So that's the job that Lee Kuan Yew takes. That's the job to be done, to create the right culture in how the country is governed. The first step is obvious. If you want to create a good system, you begin by attracting good people to government positions. Make government jobs highly coveted. Thankfully, in the Confucianist culture, the profession of the scholar or the politician is considered the most noble profession in the hierarchy of professions. So he has that going on for him at least. But that's not enough. You cannot depend only on the belief system of the land to keep attracting great talent decade after decade. You also need the right incentives. So in 1973, when the Singapore government starts generating some revenue, Lee Kuan Yew revises the salaries of politicians and bureaucrats. And these new salaries are significantly higher than their peers from other countries, even the developed countries. Even today, Singaporean ministers and employees are some of the highest paid government employees in the world. The idea is simple. High salaries attract high quality people. And if they are paid well, they will not feel the need for corruption, the biggest disease that paralyzes developing countries and destroys all order. This is a unique Lee Kuan Yew invention. And of course, it's common sense, it works. But attracting the best people isn't enough. They also need to work efficiently. The downside of attracting the best people to the government and paying them high salaries is that very quickly they become the social elite of the country. And then the excesses begin, the lobbying, the inefficient spending of money, the special interest groups, and politicians start funding programs not because the country really needs them, but because they have some personal vested interest in them. And governments can do that because they can literally print money out of thin air. Example number one in the current context is the US. That's exactly what the US is dealing with right now. So, how does one stop that from happening? Well, culture and values. One of the most important value of the Singaporean government is that it does not run fiscal deficits. It always runs surpluses. That's non-negotiable. Lee Kuan Yew thought that it was immoral for a government to run a deficit. Just like a loss-making company is not sustainable, a loss-making country is not sustainable as well. To put that in perspective and how impressive that is, the US has run fiscal deficits and large ones for 37 of the last 40 years. This is the most impressive thing for me. Large fiscal deficits are the bane of governments. That's how the ruin begins. That's what takes countries down. For Singapore, right from the start, it is a non-negotiable value. That's culture right there. The Singapore government is still one of the most well-run, efficient governments of the world, even to this day, long after Lee Kuan Yew has passed away. That's the power of culture. Culture is destiny. When Deng Xiaoping visited Singapore in 1978, this is what he saw. The talent of the people working for the government, their discipline, their culture, the policies and the systems they had in place, the cleanliness on the streets, the new infrastructure, and most importantly, the investments that had come from America that had helped upskill the people of Singapore. Inspired by Lee Kuan Yew, Deng instituted the open door policy in 1979, inviting foreign investments in his special economic zones. And he built the city of Shenzhen, or at least the modern version of it. And China's economic miracle began. Alright, so far we've seen that Lee Kuan Yew has created this flywheel of sorts by starting with creating social order. Then that order attracts foreign investments. Hopefully the investments increase people's incomes, they prosper economically, and there is an inbuilt incentive for people to maintain that order. And it all becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, a flywheel. And then focus on creating the right culture. That helps to keep that flywheel running. That's the broad thinking, that's the broad strategy. But this is all top-down. What about bottom-up? A fundamental Confucian idea is that it integrates the top-down and the bottom-up approaches. In fact, it is vitally important for the entire system to work. The ruler can be righteous and benevolent, but that's not enough. The citizens themselves also have to actively contribute to the social order and economy for the order to sustain. Lee Kuan Yew can pass all the right laws to promote social cohesion, but the citizens themselves have to come together and feel like they have a common ground, a common identity in some way, for that social cohesion to really hold. And one of the major impediments that's preventing Singaporeans from coming together is language. They all speak different languages, so how can they intermingle? I mean, top down, you can proclaim that there's social cohesion, but for it to develop organically, bottom up, the different ethnic groups have to interact with each other socially. And language is the number one thing stopping that. So Lee Kuan Yew makes perhaps the most controversial decision of his career. He takes on another risk, a major political risk this time. He makes English the official language of Singapore. He instructs the schools and changes the curriculums to impart education in English. And the Singaporeans don't like this idea one bit. There's a lot of opposition, especially from the Chinese population that forms a 75% majority. They feel that Lee Kuan Yew is betraying his Chinese heritage by forcing English down their throats. So it's a massive political risk for him because the majority is slowly turning against him. But he knows that it's the right thing to do, not only because it will bring people together, but also because it will actually help them in an economic sense. If Singapore has to become the favored destination for global companies, Singaporeans need to speak the de facto global language. That will give them an edge against all the other East Asian countries where people, even to this day, cannot speak English. This one decision, in my opinion, is the biggest cultural transformation that has happened in Singapore since its independence. I have lived in Singapore for 6 months. Everyone speaks English. You can easily get by if you know English, but you cannot say that for literally any other country in that part of the world. China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Malaysia. That's obviously an edge if you want other countries to invest in your country. But there's obviously a downside. And Lee Kuan Yew was aware of that. Because language is a very emotional part of one's life. If you take language away, that place doesn't feel like home. One of the things that makes home feel like home is the mother tongue that we speak in it. And Lee Kuan Yew would be the first one to tell you that citizens need to feel at home. They need to have skin in the game. Only then they can care for the country's future. And there's already a problem on that front with the amorphous nature of the Singaporean identity. So he needs something else that will make Singaporeans care for their home. Now, there are many things that Lee Kuan Yew does, but I want to touch upon a simple idea that proved to be very effective. And I know this whole episode is sounding like a eulogy to Lee Kuan Yew, but well, he is a once-in-a-generation leader. It is because he got so many things right that you and I are still talking about him. And we'll come to the controversial part, but before that, I want to touch upon this one simple idea that I think is just pure genius and shows the wisdom of Lee Kuan Yew. So what he does from the very beginning is he begins promoting the practice of home ownership over renting. He starts a subsidized public housing program called the HDB, or the Housing Development Board, and he allows people to take money out of their CPF savings. CPF is the government savings scheme, so think of it as a provident fund scheme. He allows people to take out savings from their CPF accounts as down payment to buy these subsidized houses. Now, from the outside, this looks like your standard welfare state measure to benefit the poorest section of the society. But that's not true. In Singapore, HDB is all pervading. It's for every citizen of the country. About 80% of Singaporeans live in these subsidized HDB houses even today. That's close to 5 million people. And I have been to these houses. They are very well designed, very well conceived, and they don't look characterless like most public housing projects in other countries do. They actually look beautiful. But here's the kicker. There's a deeper, profound motive behind this program, a deeper wisdom. Here's what Lee Kuan Yew writes about the HDB program in his memoir. It's amazing. I quote, "After observing how differently people maintain their own apartments as against rented ones, I believed that a deep sense of property was instinctive in a person. During the riots of the 1950s and early 60s, people would join in the rioting, stone windscreens, overturn cars and burn them. When riots broke out in the mid-1960s, after they owned homes and property, they acted differently. I saw young men carrying their scooters parked on the roads to safety up the stairs of their HDB blocks. I was strengthened in my resolve to give every family solid assets, which I was confident they would protect and defend, especially their home." End quote. Today, about 90% of Singaporeans own the house they live in. That means 90% of the population has an emotional connection to Singapore, an inbuilt incentive to maintain order in Singapore. That's why they send their young children for compulsory military conscription to protect their home. That's why they keep the country clean. That's why they have an equity in Singapore's future. Isn't that amazing? By the way, that quote is from Lee Kuan Yew's memoir, From Third World to First, the Singapore Story. I highly, highly recommend this book. I think it should be a mandatory read for every leader, whether you lead a country, a startup, a company, or any group of people, really. And I don't say this for many books, but honestly, that book helped me become a better person. Because even though Lee Kuan Yew is talking about nation building in this book, he talks it from literally first principles. So you get to see his mind, his morality, his consciousness in action. I highly recommend it. Singapore today obviously is one of the richest countries in the world. Its GDP per capita of over 150,000 US dollars is the second highest of any country in the world. It ranks very high in literally all human development indicators. And it's just a lovely country to stay in. It's hard to believe that just about 50 years back, this country was on its last legs and would not have survived as a country, let alone become the most prosperous in the world. And if you ask any Singaporean today, especially the older Singaporeans, that how did it happen, just tell us in one line, they will only say three words: Lee Kuan Yew. Charlie Munger, the late great Charlie Munger, may he rest in peace, was such a fan of Lee Kuan Yew that he actually had a life-size bust of his in his house alongside Benjamin Franklin, the only two busts he had. And the reason was that Munger believed that there is no statesman in history who just did what the right thing was without copying the West, without falling for dogma, or without pandering to any group. Just like the West's major political system of liberalism and democracy is derived from a Judeo-Christian tradition, Lee Kuan Yew devised his own political system, drawing from the Confucianist tradition. That's his creation, that's his genius. Alright, let's address the elephant in the room now. I think it'd be unfair if I do not at least recognize the accusation that has been levied on Lee Kuan Yew by many Western commentators, that he was a dictator, although benevolent, that despite Singapore being a democracy that holds free and fair elections, that see massive participation, Lee Kuan Yew did not face any significant political opposition, and that Singapore is essentially a one-party system, with PAP, the People's Action Party, that's Lee Kuan Yew's party, having a hegemony over governing Singapore. Now, my personal opinion must be obvious to you. The fact that I'm doing this episode means that I think of him as a great statesman and not some kind of a dictator. But let me quote someone else on this matter. Someone who's 1,000 times more educated than me in these matters. And you can try and guess who the quote is from. Here it is, and I quote, Lee Kuan Yew would not be true to himself were he less than frank about his analysis of the difference between the individualism of the West and the priority for social cohesion in countries such as his. He does not ask us to change our patterns, only to refrain from imposing them on societies with different histories and necessities. Let me repeat that second line. He does not ask us to change our patterns, only to refrain from imposing them on societies with different histories and necessities. End quote. And that's the crux of the issue here. That the West, and I think all of us broadly fall in that category, the fact that you are listening to this episode in English means that you and I are Western educated in some sense. We sometimes tend to see Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew through our own lens, our own ideas of liberalism, democracy, and political freedom. That's not how Singaporeans see their own government. That's not how the Chinese see their government. Because they have had a different history. They celebrate different values. They expect different things from their government. So then who are we to judge? Lee Kuan Yew died on 21st March 2015 at the age of 91, just a few months before Singapore celebrated its 50th Independence Day. An estimated 1.2 million people paid their last respects to Lee Kuan Yew in person at the Parliament House and at various tribute centers across Singapore. Many lined up for hours, with some waiting overnight, showing their respect for his contribution to their lives. People from all walks of life, from all communities, Chinese, Malay, Indians, all mourned his death and shed tears and remembered the great man. Remember that fateful day when Lee Kuan Yew had cried in front of the entire nation after being thrown out by Malaysia? He was told that the dream he had all his life was not going to come true. He imagined a new future, a new dream, and he lived that dream with honesty and conviction and changed the destiny of his people. That's all in this episode of All Risk is Creative. See you in the next episode. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to All Risk is Creative. This podcast is owned and produced by COZM Entertainment Private Limited. Original music composed by Mehul Fadnavis. Sound mixing and mastering by Ankit Thakur. And I'm your host, Palash Kulkarni. You can find me on X at A Bigger Splash. That's ABIGGERSPALASH. If you have any feedback on the podcast, you can DM me on X or write to me at palash@cozm.in. That's COZM.in.